Welcome to episode 1 of our new series, Spiritual Success. Today we have with us Nadav Beati. He's going to speak to us a little about himself, his professional career. He works for Lenovo. He is the head of the cybersecurity business. And before we get into that, I want to give a bit of introduction what this show is about. So many times people think that to be religious contradicts living a successful life. And we want to show that it's on the contrary. Nowadays, when you have a spiritual twist to your successful life, to your professional career, you could actually benefit much more from that. And we'll start with Nadav, share a little bit about himself, and progress from there.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. I think the show that you're doing and the message that you're trying to get out is really, really important, especially coming from myself with where I come from and my background and operating in the professional world. It's a significant challenge. A lot of us think that, or maybe even an impossibility, that I can be a religious Jew and at the same time be in the professional world, right? A lot of times we think, oh, a religious Jew is somebody who sits, all day in the yeshiva, and like that's what the definition of it is, and there's nothing, of course, wrong with that, but you can still be a religious Jew and have a professional career, operate in the secular world. And from my standpoint, the rabbi said, I run a very, very large business unit at one of the largest companies in the world, and there are challenges, but there are also opportunities, I think, that come from that experience.
Most definitely. So what we wanted to maybe, before we get into the professional aspect of your story, we want to maybe focus on your childhood a little bit.
Sure.
Where are you from? Some maybe stories that brought you to the place you are today.
Yeah, sure. So my parents are Parsi. I was born in the U.S. I grew up in Orange County in Southern California, right? So, for those of you who are familiar with, the Persian community, the Parsi community, California, Southern California is a huge community. And I grew up in an environment that I would say was definitely not religious. Very secular, 100% secular, but at the same time was spiritual. So, my mom in particular was somebody who was a very, very spiritual person. She always had a belief and an affinity to God, but there was no real religion. And I think, especially coming from some of that background, a lot of people in the Persian community, at least in our circle, they had a very negative relationship with religion, especially because of the things that happened in Iran and the revolution, and they saw kind of that religion can be used for negative. And so, I grew up in a very secular environment, public school, had no religious education or background at all. And then, left Southern California for university. I went to a secular university, did, my master's degree at a secular university, and it wasn't really until after that kind of formal education in the secular world and entering in the professional world that I came to where I am now, obviously. But I think a lot of us have that that fire inside of them, that there's something more. That there's there's more than what we see. I almost, for those of you who've seen the movie The Matrix, right? I use the example of, like, you start to feel like we're living in the Matrix, and there's more. It's not just, you're not just born, work, die, and that's it. And that was really the question, or the spark, or the itch that started for me.
Amazing. I'm actually very happy that you brought up The Matrix for the example. It's well known that the brothers who actually produced the movie The Matrix, they did have some sort of Kabbalistic background.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea, Neo, they explained that Neo is the same letters as the One,
mm-hmm.
as the Messiah, and whole spiritual outlook to the movie. But there is one definitely big point that I think that everyone that watches the movie thinks about, where how we see Neo pretty much having to make a decision. Does he go back to his regular mundane life where he's living the illusion, or does he face the truth? And that's, Morpheus gives him the 2 pills, going back to the... So definitely that was something that I think is a relevant point to the spiritual journey that I think many people are finding out about nowadays, that the seek for God, the seek for if there's an afterlife. We actually wanted to maybe get a little bit about more information about your professional position, what
Sure.
is included, and
Yeah, so from a professional standpoint, I mean, I lead the cybersecurity business at huge tech companies, Fortune 250 companies, so multi-billion-dollar company. I've got a team that's spread all over the world. I have team members in Israel, team members in the U.S., in Asia, in Europe, and so my path to getting to that place was, if you were to ask me, when I came out of university, did I think I'd be working in tech and cybersecurity, I would have said no, right? Because at least at that time, 20 years ago, nobody really knew anything about anything.
right.
But it's been very exciting, and Baruch Hashem, like I wake up, and when you do shachrit in the morning, like one of the things that I say is I'm thank you, like I'm very lucky, and I think that's one of the things that being a religious Jew gives you operating in the professional world. You're not looking at it from the standpoint of like, wow, I've achieved this, or I'm here because of my hard work and because I made all the right moves and all this stuff. You really, I think you try to get to the place where you say, thank you, like just thank you Hashem, like thank you for the fact that you've given me a livelihood, you've given me a work that I enjoy, that's where I think it's the spirituality and the religious piece of it really starts to come into play. Is I think the first step is having that fear of Hashem, in terms of like we're being recorded, right? Like we're at one point someday we're all going to stand in front of the real big Beit Din, so to speak.
Right.
But it's just getting to that place of being thankful. Like, I have a roof over my head, I have food to eat, I have a comfortable life, I have a job that I enjoy. If I'm logical about it, even if you want to remove religion for a moment, and you say to yourself, okay, there are 8 billion people in the world. I'm not the smartest person by any stretch of the imagination. So it can't just be because of me. Do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't, like, even if you look at it from a statistical standpoint, right? Or if you look at certain people in the world of like, how did this person get to that position, or this person is not in that position? Those are the types of questions that a person starts to, unravel, of like, it doesn't, logically it doesn't add up. That there is no God, and there, like, you start to, and that's kind of where you go back of like taking the red pill. Like, if you ask yourself those questions honestly, you may not like the answer, because the answer means there are rules, and the answer means like, responsibility and things, but
Right.
then you're lying to yourself if you're not asking yourself those questions, I think.
It's a very powerful statement. I actually want to touch up on the point that Nadav was saying regarding when you're living. I could say that also I have a story where I was secular and later on became religious. It's a whole different way of looking at the world, at your success. And it seems as if the Western world is currently chasing after being successful. And when Chazal, our sages, they ask, Ezu Ashir, who is the one who is rich? It's Bodan HaSameach B'Chelko, one who is happy with his portion, what he has. So the point that you're bringing out, that to start off your day with gratitude and feeling thankful for what you have, and not really focusing on how great I am and what's my next step, but how grateful I am for the situation that I'm currently in. I think it's a powerful point. And we also know that the attribute of humility, which we see in Nadav, is very talented, very successful, but when you hear him speak, you see that he doesn't take credit for himself. And whoever knows Nadav, I've met him about a year ago, and you see a person who really, he's full of humility. He always is friendly, never comes off as a person, I work for this big company, and you see that he lives based on these principles. And it's a thing that I think definitely gives all of us chizuk. When I met you, I could tell you guys, share maybe something that Nadav will feel comfortable to share with us, that he's actually in the middle himself of doing a Rabbanut course. So on top of the fact that he has his crazy busy days and soon a wedding coming up, Bezat Hashem, and on top of that, I can say that every day we have now a class that we do on Zoom for 30 minutes. Nadav is in that class daily, and I'm sure that he has other learning and other full jam-packed days. So kind of maybe you can give us a little bit of tips on time management?
From a time management standpoint, and you know, I was thinking about this. So like it's about prioritization, right? There is time. When people say like I don't have time in the day. Like I don't have time in the day to go work out, or I don't have time in the day to study or read, or meet with a chavruta. There is time in the day. You just have to make the time and prioritize it, right? So, okay, are you going to sleep until, if you've got to start work at, let's say, 8 o'clock, are you going to sleep until 7 or 7:30? Or are you going to say to yourself, okay, I'm going to wake up a little bit earlier to make sure that I can do shachrit and like maybe get like a 15 minutes of study time in.
Right.
And then, okay, in the evening, instead of saying, all right, like I've had a long day at work, like now I want to sit and I'm going to turn on, the Netflix or, watch a movie, like you can do that or you can study, but don't say that there is no time, because you can make the time. All we have is a little bit of time, like that we're here.
Right.
And so from my standpoint, and again, like I have my failings in this area massively like everybody else. There are times where I'm just tired, like I'm exhausted. I've had a long week or a long day. But I try and one of the things that I found is helpful is habit. So like for me, I start my day, shachrit and then work. Sometimes like I was saying, I've got a team all over the place. So sometimes my first call for work is, 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning. So I got to wake up, do a call, and then I do shachrit, and then it's like, okay, now I'm going to get a work day in, but now then it's, okay, I have like an hour break here. I have an hour break here that I can manage my time. Let me study, let me read. Let me, work on, for me, one of the things that I'm also trying to work on is Hebrew. So, the amazing benefit that we have, right? Like, in our time, yes, there's a lot of distraction. It's very, very difficult to try to be a religious person in this world. But the flip side to that, I think Hashem has also given us the benefit of technology, right? So it's not like your Rabbi Akiva who's got to get up and move to a different country.
Right.
You have so many resources at your fingertips, right? I mean, I study 3 times a week. I have a chavruta who I've never met him in person, right? He lives in Lakewood. We get together on Zoom. Baruch Hashem, we'll meet one day when the situation with COVID is a little bit better, right? There are classes available online. You mentioned I just finished Hilchos Shabbos. I'm about to start Isur V'Heter. All this stuff is available online, right? And it's not to do it from the standpoint like, I'm not going to go become a rabbi. Like, that's not the point. The point is to learn, like that, even that 30 minutes or that hour that you're sitting there and you're learning. I feel like, and it sounds ridiculous when you say it sometimes, like it's going to sound ridiculous, I think, right now when I say it, like you feel like you're sitting there with the mechaber, you feel like you're sitting there with Shach, and like, you know what I mean? You're sitting there with these giants.
Wow.
And that's the only connection that you have. And so I say put it in that context, right? Like, I'm going to spend 30 minutes, 1 hour doing that, or I'm going to spend 30 minutes or 1 hour sitting and like vegging out in front of Netflix. If you've only got that hour, like that's the choice. Like it's, an hour of something that has sustained us for 3,300 years as a people, or I'm gonna watch, I don't know, the latest thing about the whatever,
Right, all the
there's the stuff that just comes and goes. Like, I mean, we live in a disposable society. The only thing that we have that's not disposable is Torah.
For sure. What Nadav is saying is extremely powerful. I think that for some of our viewers, it might be on a high level, and that's why I want to actually have you share something maybe a little bit personal with us. So I could say that maybe even myself, 10 years back, if I was to listen to this interview, I would also ask myself, what are these terms, shacharit, Torah, and all these different things? And I'm sure that there are people out there that are watching and they're asking, what are these different terms that you're using? And obviously each one is a world on its own. I'm not going to ask you to explain and elaborate, but what does interest me is, I'm sure that also going maybe 6 years back or 7 years back when you were in the college, or I don't know exactly when maybe you'll share with us, your journey started, there was a certain point of transition where the typical college, LA, successful, whatever you were dealing with at the time, becomes a person of, the Nadav that we're seeing today. So could you maybe share the point of transition?
Sure. Yeah, so I think for me the point of transition was I was going through a very challenging and difficult time in my life, a lot of changes in my life going on several years ago. And it spurred for me kind of wanting to understand and learn more about some of my own personal history, my family history, and kind of where my family came from. And that opening that envelope a little bit, or that book a little bit, and seeing, learning about it, then spurred like the questions, right? The logical questions of, I think those questions that we all have, like, is this just it? Like, especially as you start to get older, right? Like, okay, is this it? Like, I wake up in the morning, I go to work, yeah, I'm successful, how many, we all have this itch that if you're, Hashem, like financially successful, you try to itch with or scratch with things, right? And then, you buy a new clothing, or you go get a new car, or you whatever, and that you get like that high for a little bit, and then it's like, okay, you're back down. And Rav Avigdor Miller, who is one of the big rabbis that I really read his books and study his books on bitachon and emunah, and like he says, like, we're all like kind of going and trying to scratch that itch, and we can never really get it, right? Because what we're trying to scratch can't be scratched by the big house and the car and these things. And again, I'm not saying those things are bad. Like, if God has blessed us with those things, thank you, Hashem, really. But it starts with those questions, and then I really wanted to go about learning and understanding of, does it actually make sense, right? So if I'm coming at it from my own secular background, no religious schooling, no religious education, didn't grow up in it. If you would have asked me, 5 years ago what Shachrit is, I would have looked at you like you're speaking like Chinese, right? Like no clue. But you start asking yourself of like, okay, I've grown up with an educational standpoint of complete honesty, in a secular education. I mean, as well, like, okay, we came from nothing, and we kind of evolved, and like these basic questions, right? These basic questions that
Right.
we have. We came from nothing and we evolved, and then just like we live, and we're basically an animal, or we live like an animal, and then we just die, and that's it. And then at some point, a big asteroid or something is going to come and hit us. And that's really not, that's one point of view. But then the other thing I looked at was starting to ask of, okay, what's the other point of view on this? What's the other, like the other perspective on this? And things started to make sense. Like, it's amazing when you start to actually read the Torah, when you start to look at it, you're like, there are too many coincidences for it to be a coincidence. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, I don't know, again, I'll go back to something that Rav Avigdor Miller wrote in one of his books of, take the concept of bread. Bread is very complex to make, right? If you think about it, very simply, bread is, you gotta, mix things, and flour and wheat and like certain amount of water. It's a very random thing that somebody was sitting around, as kind of the secular point of view tells us, is, hey, we were basically sitting around like monkeys, and somebody just decided, hey, let me go and make something really complicated out of nothing. You know what I mean? Or, that
Many examples.
Examples like that. But you start
yeah.
to ask these basic questions.
Right.
And the thing is, you have to ask them. You have to admit to yourself that maybe what I know and what I understand, or what I think I know, maybe that's not right. And if it is, great. But maybe it's not.
So now that you're saying 5 years back, you wouldn't know what Shacharit is.
Yeah.
So maybe it's an opportunity to explain to our viewers what Shacharit means to today, in simple terms, that person that maybe might not be familiar with prayers.
Yeah. So I think in order to answer that question, I think I'll say this, right? Just becoming religious is hard. Especially becoming like a religious Jew is hard, because we have, frankly, I'll be honest, we have a lot of rules. We have a lot of rules. We have a lot. And I think that's the first thing that I think people, at least for me, is, if you're a religious person of any other sect of religion, it's like, okay, I go to church once a week, or I do this, or I do that. Being a religious Jew is the rest of your life falls around being a religious Jew. Do you know what I mean? Like, you have to structure your life in a way of, okay, I have to make sure that I have time to wrap tefillin. I have to make sure I have time to say Kriyat Shema, or, to say the Shema before, the period of cutoff. I have to, so there's a lot of different things, and that's hard for people to get around. And I think, especially for secular people who didn't grow up from, that's like, oh, these are a bunch of ridiculous rules, right? And I think from my own personal self, it was a very hard entry into that, right? I mean, there are definitely times where I was like, I don't feel like waking up early and saying Shachrit. Or the morning prayers, right? Shachrit is the morning prayers. I don't feel like, doing X, or I don't feel like doing Y, or I don't feel a connection to it right now at this point in time with this particular prayer. And I think the thing for me that was impactful was it became, and it has to start to become part of your process, like part of your day, right? Like, I wake up, like, for me, it's very important, because especially for what I do, like, if I don't go and do something physical and active for 30, 45 minutes in a day, I go crazy, because I'm in front of the computer the whole day. Right. So going to work out is part of my routine. Okay, well, you make part of your routine waking up in time so you can wrap tefillin, so you can do your morning prayer, so you can do the afternoon prayer, so you have time. Then it gets, more structure in your week of, okay, now let me make sure that when a person makes that leap of, okay, now I'm going to be Shomer Shabbat, let me make sure that I'm like, okay, Wednesday, I'm thinking in my head, what am I going to cook for Shabbat? Thursday, I'm starting to do grocery shopping, clean the house, get ready, so I'm all set, so that I can go into Shabbat, like, sometimes straight out of work, or a little bit out of work, but like, prepared, things are prepared. So again, I think it's a very, very difficult thing because you're hit with it from everywhere. And I think the thing that I noticed the most is you ask yourself these questions, and the more you ask yourself your questions, and if you're intellectually honest with yourself, because you're not going to like the answers to some of these questions. You're not, because they mean that, okay, well, now wait, wow, like, now, like, I can't do anything on Friday night? Oh, now I can't, like, go out to a restaurant? Because, I mean, we live in the Bay Area. Our options for eating out, I mean, we literally have, like, 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, I can't do this, I can't do that. And these are very hard things. And you're hit with it from your friends and family who are like, oh, we're having an event on Saturday. Oh, sorry, like, I can't. And they get offended, right? Like, what do you mean you can't? You're becoming crazy, you're becoming this. And then unfortunately, you're hit with it as well, to some extent, depending on where you are, from people who are from. Because you're on a different place, you know what I mean?
Right, when you discover yourself through the journey, sometimes you find yourself on a higher level than people that kind of grew up into that, and they're just doing that.
But also you're going to be alone, unfortunately, in a lot of respects. It's a lonely process because you don't really fit in. And when you were talking about this series, that's why I thought this series was really, really important, because you're almost, especially in that beginning part, you're operating in 2 worlds. Like, you weren't from, so like, you didn't grow up with those things, and the From community kind of looks at you, or like the really, like, people who are really Orthodox, like, they kind of look at you as like, oh, like, what's this person? Like, this,
an outsider.
The outsider, and then they're like, oh, maybe you're not doing this right or that right, and then your old world, right, your friends and family are looking at you of like, oh, this person's becoming like a fanatic, right? Like, so you're in this place of like, it's a lonely process. But I think, I don't know, maybe that's part of the challenge that Hashem throws in front of you of like, hey, how bad do you really want this, right? Your ancestors walked in the desert for 40 years, how bad do you want it?
Correctly, you were once, you appeared on TED Talks.
Yeah, so it was, I do a lot of public speaking for work. Conferences, a lot of different interviews. So I spend a lot of time doing public speaking events. A little bit less now because of the pandemic, but it's part of my my job.
I remember looking on the internet, doing a little bit of research before our interview, and I saw that you were on some lineup with Prime Minister of Israel.
Yeah, yeah. So I've spoken a couple times in Israel. Again, up until 2 years ago, I was in Israel very often. Every 6 weeks or so, and I had the great opportunity to one of the last conferences right before Corona hit. To speak at Cybertech in Tel Aviv, and so there's a huge cybersecurity conference, and Prime Minister speaks there, the head of the National Cyber Directorate. People come in from all over the world, so it's a big, very nice opportunity.
Amazing. It's beautiful to see this. 1 second Dav could speak to us about Cybertech world, next second to speak to us about the spiritual world, and in actuality, whoever really learns the more in-depth, the Kabbalistic principles of our Torah, he knows that it's like codes. Like a person who is a programmer, there are codes that cause the software to work. Right? If there wasn't a person who doesn't understand that, might not be able to connect between all the zeros and ones and then the program that he's looking at. But in actuality, we were taught that the halakha and the Kabbalah and the Torah and all these different things that, like you said, might seem odd to certain people, are actually things that are holding up the spiritual makeup of the creation. So that's a big honor that we have when we put on the tefillin, when we do this, learn Torah, all these different things. As Jews, we very much believe that we're not just doing a surface action, something much deeper, something much more meaningful. Thank you for joining us on episode 1 of Spiritual Success.